Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. It is Monday, no longer a holiday, but that means you should be driving back home at 5 o'clock, enjoying the high IQ takes I dispense with every Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're listening on another time frame, make sure to sneak it in at work. However you listen, make sure to listen to the premiere because that is a truly respected audience who appreciates my show. That's when they listen to it. But today I have a general overall topic that I'm going to try to tie in a lot of news stories with, and it is the topic of culture and the American rights relationship to it. And many things are covered by the term culture. I mean, it's not just what we think of like paintings or high culture or museums that we imagine when we hear that term. It covers sports. It covers daily interactions with people. It just covers how we view the world and the mediums we use to express our worldview as modern Americans. And now a lot of right-wingers always complain about culture or say that we need to focus more on culture building and, focusing on that area in order to win. Is that we're not just going to focus on everything by being too political or staying on politics. Is that politics is downstream from culture, thus we need to go and challenge culture more, which I'm sympathetic to that view. But I want to explore that with a couple of different topics that have happened, last week or over the past month or so. So the first topic I want to go into this is, of course, the Jon Gruden emails. Now you may say, like, how does this have to do with culture? This is like sports. This is the standard tabloid story that has nothing to do with anything. Some people may say that, but that's not necessarily true. There's a lot going on here, as I like to say. Jon Gruden, for those who don't know, is one of the more famous NFL coaches. He won a Super Bowl with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers back in the early 2000s. He was an ESPN commentator for many years after that. Then he just returned to the, I think they were still the Oakland Raiders when he returned to them, but they're now the Las Vegas Raiders. And he got, they were doing an investigation into the Washington football team's operations, which you may remember them as the Washington Redskins. And they are looking into this, and they got hundreds of thousands of emails. And for some reason, the only emails they decided to release were Jon Gruden's. Jon Gruden was never an official member of the Washington football team or the Redskins organization. When all these emails occurred, they were still called the Redskins. He was not a coach for them. He was just emailing one of their manager and talking with him, one of their executives, and talking with them about random stuff. It was just two friends shooting the shit. And in these emails, he made some racially insensitive comments about the head of the NFL union, the NFL Players Association, some other disparaging comments about minorities and gays and women. And of course, he was out. You cannot say these things in private conversation. This is terrible. We cannot allow Jon Gruden to continue to speak offensive things in private to his friends. So not only was Jon Gruden forced to resign, he was also completely erased from the NFL. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers had him in their Ring of Honor. They removed him from that because he violated their team values. The new Madden game has removed his presence through a mandatory update. And they're completely getting rid of him as he's like the worst person in the world simply for saying offensive things to his friends in private communication. Now, there are a lot of things that the NFL overlooks in their players. There have been many rapists, drug dealers, even a few murderers. There have been tons of terrible people to play in the league, and they're still honored. I think they still honor. I was seeing some recent clip, I believe it was from this year, of like Ray Lewis going out in the Ravens Stadium and doing his trademark dance. And then you're like, Ray Lewis was accused of being an accomplice to a murder. Now, of course, the justice system cleared him, but if you even read the story about it, there's something very suspicious going on where, they had been reports of him having bloody clothes after the murder. A lot of things that are left unresolved by this case, but Ray Lewis is fawned over. He never was really punished. He's seen as one of the icons of the league history. And this is a guy who was accused of quite possibly, allegedly, being involved in murder, even though it didn't come out in the case. He was never prosecuted for it. Now, that is one. And then there's people in the league like Antonio Brown, credibly accused of assault, spousal abuse, I believe even even sexual assault. He's still allowed to play in the league, actually for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Deshaun Watson is accused by nearly 24 women of sexual misconduct, still allowed to play in the league. There are tons and tons of people who are still associated with the league, not erased from the league, who are still honored by the league, are still allowed to play, who are far worse than Jon Gruden's offense. But the Jon Gruden's offense is the worst thing that can happen to you. Is expressing wrongthink is worse than actual crime. Even murder. And there's even a guy who's one of the Nike executives, Larry Miller. He actually murdered somebody in the 60s. And he had his coming out story. He called it a coming out story in Sports Illustrated last week. And he did serve time for it. He served, I think, 10 or 12 years for it. Not a very long. He was a juvenile when he did it. So he's like 16. I believe he got out when he's 30. So, he served a fair amount of time for it. And he is now like, I have this deep secret I want to share. And it's like, I killed somebody. And the league, this is somebody who works closely with the NBA. His department is closely linked to it. I think he oversees the Air Jordans, the Air Jordan department at Nike. And they're all like, we're so proud of you for admitting this, that you murdered somebody as a teenager. And the whole article was treating this like he was coming out as gay. It's like, this is so powerful. Thank you for coming out as a murderer. You're just like, what? And they're all treating this like, we're so proud of you. We're glad we now have a justice system that understands you made a mistake and you've made a much better life for yourself. And so, Larry Miller is treated as this like hero, and he's so great for coming out as a murderer. And then Jon Gruden is seen as far worse than him simply for making fun of a guy's lips in a private communication. And, that is a part of our cultural mindset. And there's a couple of things going on with that are concepts that I've talked about a lot in the past, both like American conservatives' unwillingness to give up on sports, particularly the NFL, particularly the sports that are really bad, and say, we hate you, we don't want you to watch you, but conservatives still watch them anyway and follow all the games and the players. And then there's also the concept of black privilege that comes into play as well. Both of these traits are important parts of our culture that I'll go into later on in the podcast when I actually make some analysis on the cultural mindset in our country, whether American conservatives can actually produce culture in a way that American liberals dominate our cultural scene. The first thing I want to discuss on this is that black privilege. There's some people who got a little irked by this. There are some people on Twitter who are saying, you're using a leftist term. You can't use privilege. This is, unless you're referring to aristocrats of the first estate, you cannot use privilege. This is a leftist term. And, there's always going to be people like that who are going to question that and are like, I'm flipping my cape over this, and it's like, what do you say to that? Privilege is a common term in our country, in our language. It's not reserved exclusively for the left, and the way we're using black privilege is accurate. It's like they are given greater leeway to do things more so than whites. And this behavior is seen within the NFL. Is that these guys get away with accusations of sexual assault, the general assault, drug use. Even murder in a way that whites could never do that, just in the cultural mindset. Now, they may not get away from the justice system in exactly the same way, but there increasingly are even getting away from the justice system, and even just the way our culture treats black crime. It's like this guy, this Nike exec is a murderer, and they're treating him like he's a victim, or he's like a powerful figure to emulate. And it's like, well, no, it's like that's like the worst crime you can commit. That's far worse than sending an offensive email. But once again, whites don't have any privilege. So if you're a white guy and you say something offensive, your life is over. But if you're a black guy and you happen to kill somebody, but you say you're really sorry or you blame racism for it, you can become a Nike executive. That's the way our society works, and that's the concept of black privilege. And even with this, is like blacks do operate as a type of exalted beings in our society. There is a status assigned to them that makes them a quasi. It's not quite aristocracy because they do not control things. They are directly control things. It's not like they're owning all the land and they're much more economically prosperous than us. It is true. They are not doing well economically. Whites do perform better than them and economically. And you know, a lot of them are living in a very dire straits. So they're not living like aristocrats. But the way our culture treats them, it is in a way that they are superior beings, and it is in the way, and you're supposed to show them a type of deference that in previous times was reserved just for the first estate. But in the weird society we live in the weird culture we have, you know, they do not necessarily have the powers that the aristocracy had. I mean, they do not have, you know, like I said, they're not controlling all the land. They're not like far wealthier than the commoners or whatever. That's not the case. But in a cultural and moral perspective, they are exalted over everyone else. And we are supposed to worship them and give them deference in a way that we're supposed to defer to aristocrats in past times. So that makes it even the privilege. You know, even if you want to say that, like, oh, you can only talk about this if you're referring to, and not be a leftist if you're referring to this to the first estate, and it's like, well, in some ways they are, and I think that's something that people need to remember. So that's all I'm going to talk about or directly address about black privilege for now. Now I want to move on to the question of sports ball and whether people are watching it. It's like, you know, a lot of people give me hate. You know, some people get very upset that I tell people to stop watching sports. They're like, you just don't get it. You're a dork. I'm watching sports. I'm betting. I'm doing sports betting. This is cool. Like, this is it. And it's like, I understand people need leisure and like entertainment. Like, I'm not necessarily one of those people who's like, no, you just need to be totally focused on like no video games, no sport, no enjoyment. You're just focused on politics 100%, and you're just reading like like the classical literature, and that's all your enjoyment. I am not suggesting that to people. People are going to have their leisure, and people like sports, and I understand the appeal of sports. I like watching sports, as do most people, and you know, it's a normal thing. And I understand also there's the appeal of sports is because it does bond you with your friends or your office workers, where you have to follow sports to have something to talk about at work the next day, or you're out with your friends. And it's just like, I do this to fit in. And people are now doing that with like prestige TV, where they have to watch like the latest like Netflix hit in order to fit in with their friends or the people around them. So I understand that appeal, and I even would do that when I worked in an office. Now, fortunately, there is not a massive office for highly respected industries, but so I don't have to worry about fantasy football anymore, or I never even played fantasy football. But I understand with people that are due. But we really do have to take this problem of NFL seriously and what sports we choose to watch. I don't say you should stop watching all sports, but you should specifically stop watching a few sports. And I think at the top of the list has to be NFL. And when people are like saying, oh, it's about building my community or my hometown, it's like these teams leave their hometown all the time. It's like the Oakland Raiders left to go to Las Vegas, and they had left to go to Los Angeles in the 80s. Like, these are teams that don't even have loyalty to their communities, and they leave all over the time. They will leave in the heartbeat. Any team that's like struggling or not getting enough fans, or the city government isn't caving into a team's demands, they'll leave. So they'll abandon their community and go for another. That's like a very odd aspect when compared to European soccer teams. When that idea is like come up with like a team just leaving to another city, that's like, what? That doesn't make sense at all. And that's very common in American sports teams. But it is like a part of our nomadic nature with Americans, is that we rarely even stay in one, or at least for the middle class, rarely stay in one place for all our lives. So people move around all the time. But yeah, people use that, and I understand that. And it's like, yeah, you want to support your city and your team and such, but it's, and most of these people aren't even tied to their old neighborhoods anymore. I kind of understand this point more if you're coming from the 60s or 70s perspective, where there is more ties for you to, or organic ties to you for a city. But it's like most of these people are living out in the suburbs. And as I'm a pro-suburb person, so I'm not hating on the suburbs, but I just want to say it's like there is even less tie to that city. But I understand like the appeal of like, yeah, the whole city's getting into the team doing well, and it's about fitting in. I understand that, but NFL is one of the worst. It is one of the worst leagues, and you are, by continuing to watch it, by continuing to go to games, by continuing to buy merchandise, you support one of the most evil institutions in this country. Like, think about this for the NFL. Not only just with the Gruden situation, where they intentionally leaked those emails to destroy a guy that they thought is a nuisance to NFL leadership, and they knew that this was more damaging than finding evidence that Jon Gruden had beaten up a bartender or stuff that like NFL players do all the time. They knew that saying anything vaguely racist was far worse for Gruden than like an actual crime. And that's how our society works. And this is also a league that turns itself into a Black Lives Matter propaganda vehicle. Like, turn on a game. If it's a marquee game, if it's like opening game, or it's a playoff, they're playing the Black National Anthem. And they have stenciled in the end zone in racism. And then you look at the helmets, and they have social justice messages on the helmets. And last year, they were putting the names of criminals who had been shot by police, many times justifiably shot by police, and they're putting their names on their helmets. It was like they were wanting to put Jacob Blake's name on his helmet, who was a sex offender, who was fighting police, who was about to grab a knife in his brawl with police, and then was shot. NFL players decided that he was a hero. This is who you're supporting when you're turning on the game, and you're going to the game, or you're buying merchandise. And the reason why people don't respect conservatives as a consumer base is because they can expect them to tolerate all of this behavior. They know that they can alienate conservatives as much as they want, but conservatives will continue to tune in. That is why no one respects conservative opinions when it comes to cultural matters. That's why the sports leagues don't do anything to appeal to conservatives. I mean, outside of these, phony patriotic displays that they have at the beginning of the game, which are now tainted by the Black National Anthem and the social justice messaging all around. And also the NFL is donating tens of millions of dollars to social justice efforts. I think even some of them are connected to George Soros. So this is what you're supporting. Why do you continue to support this? And then you want to complain. It's like, well, why don't we have right-wing culture? Why don't conservative culture? We're like, where's the conservative culture makers? It's because you put up with this slop. You put up with this intolerance from these people. You put up with this crap all the time, and you will turn into the game because you're like, oh, I want to be a normal person. Oh, I don't want to be a dork. I don't want to be those anti-sports ball people. Go Browns! Like, you are the one perpetuating this. And this is why they don't know, like the Hollywood studios and sports teams, they don't need to care about conservatives. They just need to care about leftists, because leftists actually make their voices heard, and they actually wield cultural power. Conservatives don't wield any cultural power, and then they still continue to support these institutions that hate them. So with the NFL and the NBA and Major League Soccer, you really need to not support them at all. Don't watch the games. Don't, go to absolutely don't go to the games, and don't buy the merchandise. And I understand the point of like watching the Super Bowl, because it is a major cultural event, and there's two appeals. Like, it's nice to like not be involved in it, but at the same time, you kind of have to be involved in it just to see like what American culture is at that point, and you see that through the halftime show and the advertisements, and it's usually very dispiriting. It's very disenchanting to see what happens. But I think it's like actively following it and all this stuff. Like, no, it's like you're coping by refusing to do this, and you cannot complain about the lack of conservative culture or the lack of, these corporations and major sports teams and studios disrespecting conservative voices when you continue to support these institutions. Just turn off the TV and stop watching the NFL. Now, with that in mind, there are other sports you can watch that are more friendly to our views, who are not imposing it, who have a better, watching the game doesn't make you feel like you're killing your soul inside. And I have to say, when you watch NFL, it's just like, as I've pointed out in my, past podcasts, analyzing the hierarchy of sports fandom, American sports fandom, and I put soccer fans at the bottom, NBA fans next up, and then NFL fandom. And one of the things I want to say is, like, NFL represents like American junk culture at its worst. Like, you just turn it on, it's like big, loud, obnoxious. The advertisements are just like big, loud, and obnoxious. And whenever they show, like when I was a kid, they used to show like NFL fans as like normal people who are like, like normal, like kind of muscular guys who are watching it, like normal bros. But now they just show like absolute losers who are watching it. Like anytime you turn it on, it's like fat people, ugly people. And that's what they have in advertisements. That's who they want to say is like the average NFL fan. So imagine what the average NFL fan is like if the advertisements even show fat, ugly people watching it in their oversized jerseys and cargo shorts. Like, just imagine the ordinary people. It's not normal people. When I see it's like, I don't want to be like these people. These people suck. And that's not enticing me to become an NFL fan. So just like the whole culture around it, even if you look at the stands, it's like... it's like you see the worst case of multicultural America in the stands, like drunk people of indiscriminate racial origin, and you're just like, what is this? Like, this is not inspiring me about our country right now, our state of America. And it's just like the culture around it is just not good. And there's other sports you can watch that are much better. Even with MLB does do a lot of cringe things, but MLB does it because they're forced to. Like, MLB is like always the most reluctant league to do this stuff, but they're dragged to do it because it's like when they boycotted Atlanta over the voting rights bill, or the voting reform bill that they did in Georgia. They reluctantly did that. They reluctantly like postponed games over Jacob Blake's shooting. They reluctantly put BLM, insignia on the stands. And like most of the players are not into it too, because most of the players are like conservative white guys who, like, even if I went to high school with some guys who made it into majors, and those guys were not woke at all. Not woke at all. And any baseball player you ever meet, it's like kind of a good old boy, like some of these guys who are still playing baseball. And there's a lot of conservatives who come from the league. Like the fact that Curt Schilling, like somebody like that who could be one of the best pitchers in recent memory, and he's now like a like a Breitbart tier conservative. Like that type of person could never come out of the NFL or the NBA. But the fact that that person could come out of the MLB speaks to the culture around baseball. And yeah, baseball does do woke things, but I think as like a culture matter, it's still preferable to MLB. And it's one of the few approved sports. Like out of the team sports, like the three that I think are okay to still watch and follow are MLB, NHL, and college football. And there's problems with all three. NHL you may think is like the best demographics. From on player perspective, like best demographics, it's like Europeans who can barely speak English, or Canadian, white Canadians. It's like, wow, this is awesome. I get to watch like people who look like me. But there's still problems with NHL. Is like DSA and leftist types are really getting into it, and just like kind of like people who are weird or like left leaning, and they're wanting to be different, but they're like, I gotta follow sport. They're like, I'll choose hockey to be different from the rest who are watching MLB or NFL. And so there is like a problem with like the fan demographic. That's not necessarily true in this, and it's also like true in the cities where like hockey has been there for a long time, like Detroit, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Even though the Antifa loves Flyers mascot, those places do have like an authentic like working class fan base that is like fairly right wing and fairly tied to their community. And I still think it's like it's better sport. And when college football, like it's terrible player demographics, but the culture around it is like made for nice white middle class conservative people. like I've said, I'm kind of repeating myself with some of these points. I know you guys have heard these talking points in the past if you listen to my podcast, but some of you may not realize that. But if you look at the culture around, and this is similar to the culture at the MLB, is like college football is one that deeply cares about traditions and heritage in its games. Like if you ever watch a game, they will say like the last time this team beat this team was 15 years ago, and this game is so important. Every game matters, so there's a greater sense of urgency and drama and intensity in college football games, especially compared to NFL. And also, yeah, it's a lot sloppier than the NFL because these guys aren't pros; they're college players. Most of them aren't going to make it in the pros, so obviously there's going to be sloppier play. But that makes it even better. Like that, like the sloppier plays. Like there's things that like, you know, a kicker trying to kick in a field goal from like 25 yards away, you're not sure if it's actually going to go in. In the NFL, you're pretty much guaranteed that that's going to go in. But there's even just like plays that a player may not make that they obviously can make in the NFL, and that adds to, you know, the drama of the play. And so that from that perspective, it's like I feel like it's a more enjoyable game to watch. But just in general, the culture around it is like for conservative white middle class people. If you look at the stands compared to an NFL game, you know, NFL game, you see like the multicultural dystopia of America. If you go look at it at a college football game, it looks like it's the widest stands you will see in any place at any major public event in America today. Even in like Midwestern schools, like where it's probably a more liberal audience, like the Wisconsin game, which I talked about when they were showing the Wisconsin stands for their first home game back, or with home game with like fans in the stands for since 2019. I know they were going crazy, and if you looked at the crowd, it's like pretty much largely white. It's like probably 85 to 90% white. And they even showed like the UT game against Ole Miss last weekend, which was a controversial game because UT fans were throwing garbage on the field and they had to delay the game to clear off the garbage. And people were like, "Oh, these guys are really rowdy." And then they went up into the stands, and every one of the stands is like a nice looking white person in like a polo or like an orange or white polo, and it looks like, and it's like, wow, these guys. You're like, well, I guess they're misbehaving, but it's also like these look like normal people that are like good, solid people, but they're maybe had a little bit too many beers to drink, and they're upset about the play calling or the refs or what the referee calls. And so I just think from that perspective, it's like a culture, and those fans like genuinely care about their traditions and culture, and it really does tie them to a region. And there's a much more genuine sense of community coming from college football fandom than NFL fandom. And it, as I said, it's like emphasizing nice middle class white people values and tastes, while like NFL, it's like you're emphasizing junk America, junk Americana with that. So just from that perspective, so I think it's like you really need to protest certain leagues, and there's like 3 team sports that you can watch, and you can also watch like if you're very middle class, you can watch golf. I hate watching golf, but you don't have to worry about the pause when watching golf. You also got NASCAR, even though NASCAR's been doing some woke things. Their fans are obviously not woke, and it's still like the drivers are still very conservative and not down with woke stuff. And then there's like MMA is another one, and of course MMA is like very hostile to the pause, and they are very pro-Trump, and a lot of the fighters are very conservative. So I think there's a lot of other sports you can watch, but I think like from a sport like the anti-sports ball, you really need to give up NFL. NFL is one of the worst. It really need to make a stand against this sport. If it's like such a terrible institution that is so hostile and doing such terrible things, you can protest it and make your voice heard by not hitting them where it hurts, and that's the ratings and in their pocketbooks. And conservatives need to learn this lesson if they want to shape the culture. Now going on to the topic of just genuine culture, like can the conservatives create their own culture in this environment that we have? And this is a topic that I was driven to discuss today because there was a debate, of course, a debate over Twitter. As many of the topics that you see on the podcast that I discuss, many of them come from Twitter. That's just the way things are sometimes. But this is what happens is there's a clip of Dave Rubin going like, well, you gotta wonder, where's the next great conservative thing gonna come from our art? We're the fun people, conservatives are, and we're gonna create art because we're not listening to the system. And this is Dave Rubin saying it, and like he's arguing that the next great culture is gonna come from conservatives. And then Anthony Fantano, some people may know him from the Needle Drop. He's a famous, some people might not know him. I'm debating how the cultural literacy of some of my listeners are, but he's a famous music critic, probably about as important as Pitchfork, the news outlet, the music outlet, which some people may or may not know, but he's a very important music critic. He's very, mostly talks about indie rock, but he also talks about some metal. And he dunked on poor Dave Rubin, saying conservatives are not fun, empathetic, or creative people. They can't create art, etc., etc. They just don't have the personality types to create great artists. They're not free thinkers, essentially what he said. And a lot of people had a ways of dunking on him. They would either appeal to the past. They're like, well, what about C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien or T.S. Eliot? And they'd cite all these great figures from the past who, would hold what we today call conservative views. Or there were people who would point out that Anthony Fantano has reviewed black metal albums, positive review black metal bands that would have some right-wing views. Like he's a big fan of Burzum and Peste Noir. And if you've listened to one of my recent podcasts, I talked about Peste Noir and how the main guy behind it is very, he is very emphatic that his music is intended to be right-wing music and right-wing art. He is not a conservative by any stretch of the measure, by any stretch of the imagination. He is like, he's always talking about how he's like a hooligan and he's getting drunk and acting like what would, he's French, but the French version of white trash, but that's like a part of their brand, Peste Noir's brand. And of course, Burzum. If you guys know who Varg Vikernes is, I don't think there needs to be explanation for why that's right-wing music. But the music itself and the lyrics aren't necessarily or have no political relevance whatsoever. I mean, they're not on political topics whatsoever. But Varg himself is a very peculiar kind of right-winger. And so there's other stuff. Even with Fantano, I don't think he's reviewed Druk before, but if he did, that would be another band. Ukrainian band that is very much about celebrating Ukrainian nationalism. A lot of the hipsters who like black metal love Druk. So there's like examples, but I mean, most people are not listening to Burzum, Peste Noir, and Druk. These are not the equivalent to what we see in left-wing culture or left-wing art that is all around us. And, there's like a point to take from this is like, and even with some of the arguments made is like people are just pointing to past figures and stuff. And it's like, well, can those people get popular today? And, to go with Dave Rubin's point, he's like saying it's like you need a fun anti-establishment spirit. And that's now found more on the right than the left, which is still true to an extent. But I think there's a misunderstanding with this. And Fantano is also stupid because it's like creative types are empathetic and whatever and like question authority and stuff, and this can only come from center left liberals like me. And also another point about Fantano is that he was also a big fan of Sam Hyde at one point, but he got, there was a lot of hit pieces written on him in I believe late 2016 or early 2017 about how he was like flirting with the alt-right, and now he's become a goody two-shoes normie center left liberal, real threat to the establishment. And now he believes all great art comes from his political spectrum, which we all know is not true. But on this point of like where the great culture is coming from next, is like the people arguing with liberals over this, they're not imagining, even though they may cite C.S. Lewis, they may cite J.R.R. Tolkien, some adventurous souls may even cite Wagner, but a lot of conservatives are like, I don't like Wagner, for particular reasons why. We won't go into that. But so they'll always cite these people that you almost view as highbrow culture, as something that is enjoyed by, it's not enjoyed by the masses. Like the masses are not reading poetry by T.S. Eliot. They're not going to they're not going to operas by Wagner or by Beethoven. Beethoven did have a great German language opera in Fidelio, but they're not going to see high culture. They're wanting, when they imagine this, they're imagining movies or music you hear on the radio. That is what people primarily think of when they think of the culture that's being debated here. Or TV shows. You know, it's like the things that are enjoyed by the masses that are popular media. So this isn't necessarily... Yes, there are plenty of great artists from the past who made high culture, or who are right-wing or had conservative views or right-wing views. I wouldn't know. Wagner is like hard to say is like a conservative about the way he lived his life, and even like his like life actions. You know, he was an active participant in the 1848 revolutions, and he supported it, and his views veered all over the place. But I enjoy Wagner's operas regardless. And when people are talking about these culture, they are talking about explicit political messages in the music, in the movies, in the TV shows. And people are like, well, we don't want politics there, but you can listen to music right now, or you can, and definitely TV shows and movies where there's like an explicit political message. It's like The Handmaid's Tale. There's a very explicit political message there. And even in shows where there's not necessarily, you know, it's not supposed to be explicitly political, there is like these hints and like strong themes that push people in a liberal direction. And even with comedy specials, I mean, now one of the great debates is over Dave Chappelle's latest comedy special on Netflix. He made a few jokes about transgender and other things, and conservatives like are soy jacking over. It's like, finally, we're pushing back against cancel culture. And generally his critiques about LGBT culture is that it's too white and they're racist, etc. And it's general, like, it's not necessarily a thing that conservatives should celebrate. And with Dave Chappelle, and Chappelle's going like, oh, this is cancel culture, I love it. But he's not, of course, being canceled. I mean, Netflix isn't canceling a special. They're also standing up for him in a way that they wouldn't for any white artist or entertainer. And you have to wonder why. And it's, well, one, they paid a lot of money for him. Two, it's also black privileges that blacks are able to get away with wrong think much more so than whites are. And even his stuff was pretty mild compared to other things that people criticize the LGBT community or LGBT people. I don't know what you want to call it. LGBT community sounds cringe. I'm not going to call that. I'm not going to say that again. Only ironically would I say that. But that is the type of stuff people are imagining with cultures. Like, it is like these comedy specials and stuff that is going to be enjoyed by the wide support of people. And the question is like whether conservatives are going to be more active in that role. And the answer is, for the time being, is no, because conservatives don't have power. And moreover, is that conservatives still, as I made this very clear in my points about the NFL, conservatives still enjoy all this liberal trash that is shoved down them. Even if it's like hates them and it explicitly says we hate conservatives, they still enjoy it. And they don't have power. It's like a lot of people are making this point on Twitter. I saw Evan Platinum, great account. I was making this is like, you know, the reason why there's like conservative art in the past is like these guys were writing for the patrons, and they were writing for these nobles and aristocrats who wanted their values upheld in the art that they were enjoying. And that's why there's all this conservative art for the past. And, you know, they were responding to a particular culture that demanded that these values be upheld and celebrated in the art that they were enjoying. Today, conservatives don't have that power. And one thing is that they make the point is that there's a certain point that, like, politics is downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from power, and it responds to who's in power, and it aims to please. And most of these artists, they just want to be able to do their craft and not be canceled. That's why they'll like be pro-vax and pro-BLM and pro at whatever cause that they're told to be supportive of in order for them to continue to tour, in order to continue to make movies, and in order to continue their life as is. They do not want to upset power. And when they make movies or music with like strong political or social themes, they aim to please people in power because that means more money for them. That means rave reviews. That means more, not only just does it mean more album sales or whatever, or more money for them, it means more praise for their work. It makes them seem like they're a serious artist if they are playing to power or what they want to hear. And that's like, look at Hamilton. Hamilton, absolutely, the musical absolutely played to power. It found all of their powers, eccentricities, and tastes, and it played to it. It's like, oh, wow, I'm listening to, imagining the founding fathers as all non-white, and they're rapping. This is so cool. I love it. And so it's not only is it trash, because that's what the elites want. They're like, ooh, it's hip-hopping. And it's not only historically inaccurate, and it's trying to portray, you know, a celebration of the founding fathers as immigrants, as multicultural and diverse, and playing up to liberal values in its musical. And due to that, that's why it was a major success, is it played to power. And that is the same with like movies and television shows, like The Handmaid's Tale. The people who are watching that are the people making decisions. As like you'll see with all these like Washington Post columnists and New York Times columnists and other people who are just love comparing everything they don't like to Handmaid's Tale. This is the type of people who enjoy that. And if like there was a cultural item, like let's like take the new Lord of the Rings TV series that's coming out. Now let's imagine that the Lord of the Rings TV series was aimed to be extremely conservative. It would have themes, it'd be warning about the dangers of mass immigration that it's subtly talked about in the show. You know, power would hate it. Like, first off, Amazon would have to cancel it. There would be boycotts and protests over it. And even now with this new Lord of the Rings property, I mean, compared to the movies, like the movies are pretty right-wing, you know, whether that's intentional or not is another discussion. But, you know, from a viewing of it, you would get right-wing themes from it. But the new TV show, they realize that they can't do that anymore. So they have to make it more appealing to power. So now it's multicultural and diverse cast. Like they're even talking about there might be LGBT relationships in it. And this is how they go about the source material. The people in power want to see their values enshrined in the art and culture that they enjoy, and the people in power are not conservative. And there is a greater consequence for being conservative and trying to be an artist. I'll put this at even a smaller scale. Like, there's a couple of black metal bands that may have had like an interview where they said something controversial, or they have lyrical themes that they don't like, and they will see their shows canceled because they don't want it, because venues worried about getting protested by having some bands they call a Nazi band. Like Marduk had a bunch of its shows canceled. They're one of the biggest black metal bands. They had a bunch of their shows canceled a few years ago because Antifa said they're a Nazi band, and they claim they're a Nazi band because they have some lyrics about World War II, which this is a band that talks about the horror and violence of World War II. It's not celebrating either side in it. It's just like typical metal lyrics. It's just talking about horror and violence. But they simply said there must be something wrong with this. Now that's taking it on one scale, but imagine like with a bigger scale. Like, if there is a rock band that is, like, rock solid, that's, like, being opposed to vax mandates. And there's even a few people who are like that. We can see even with the protests that have been launched against Morrissey, who, like, makes a bunch of right-wing statements, against Eric Clapton, who is now strongly against vax mandates, and there's, like, people wanting to, you know, boycott his work. You know, there comes a greater consequences for that, which there are zero consequences for making the left-wing political statements that power likes. There's actually rewards for it. I mean, look at all the artists who did endorsements of Biden, like Billie Eilish. Like, she got rewarded by this. But there are consequences if like an artist of that stature wants to endorse Trump, or wants to even make a song that deals with right-wing themes, or wants to is vocally supportive of causes that power hates. And so that's just not going to work out, as we see with those artists. And even look at an industry that is very conservative. And also, like, those black metal bands are getting, you know, canceled. It's coming from a culture that was once, you know, prides itself on being politically incorrect and offensive, but, you know, and being rebellious and nonconformist. But apparently, if Antifa says otherwise, that's not the type of nonconformity that they want. But even looking at a conservative industry like country music, you know, people there have to worry about, like, making political statements. I mean, Jason Aldean, who's one of the biggest country artists, He's seeing a backlash for his wife making anti-Biden t-shirts. This is country music too. This is country music, which you think is like the last bastion against cancel culture and for conservative culture. They even have to worry about that. And of course, there's the Morgan Wallen case where this guy was drunk and said the N-word, not even the hard R, and it was like clearly like saying this as he was mimicking rap lyrics rather than him like sounding like a racist from the 1960s. And he was entirely canceled by the industry. And this is one of the biggest young artists there is. And he was entirely canceled by the industry just for being drunk and saying the N-word, not even the hard R. And that's like what the standards are set. And that's not even a political statement of two, but you just have to imagine like anything that gives offense. Like imagine if some guy, if a country artist was saying things that gays found offensive. Such as in the case with the rapper DaBaby, his comments about gays weren't even like necessarily anti-gay. They're like, "Oh, my gay fans have class. They're not getting blowjobs in a parking lot." Apparently, that was enough to get him canceled as like as a homophobe, this is like a bizarre comment. I don't understand that. But even imagine like a country artist making a less bizarre statement, but a very critical statement of gays, that person would face a backlash, and that person is playing for an audience that is primarily conservatives. And that's because conservatives don't have power. Now, going to the second point of like what like conservatives enjoy or what type of culture they want, it's like also they support trash, even when it's right wing. It's like they love these rappers who make like anti-cancel culture songs like Tom McDonald. And they're like, this is finally great art. And it's like, man, this stuff is terrible. Like, this is, like, you really can't complain against me when I'm, like, listening to black metal. At least, like, with the black metal bands, they're trying to make good music first. Or good music, in my opinion, even though most people think it's noise. But it's like they're focused more on music. And then they, like, the themes or, right-wing themes or whatever, they come second. They're not trying to make propaganda music. They're trying to make good music as first. And that's really what the point about making good art is. Like, you're mostly focused not on trying to make a propaganda message. You're mostly focused on making good art. And that's like the same, I think, with a lot of great right-wing art is that the artists themselves may have these political opinions, and they may infuse some of these themes subtly into the work, or there may be some lyrics or some, words said in a movie that, indicate, where the political opinions stand, but they stand up as art on their own, and that no matter what your political beliefs, you can enjoy it. With the anti-woke rap, it's like you have to have like BoomerCon views to enjoy the music, because otherwise you're just like, this is like a propaganda thing. This is like this is not good. Even if you enjoyed rap, like I have like my own problems with rap, but it's like, if you're listening to this, like, this is just bad. And I mean, it's like, it's interesting that this stuff gets big. Like, they were promoting about how this song, This Is War, by some group called High Res, that's like anti-mandates. And it got really big on iTunes chart. And it's like, it's interesting that this is showing that people are liking this message, but this is not like, this is not the equivalent of Beethoven here. This is not T.S. Eliot's poetry or Ezra Pound's poetry. This is just propaganda statements, and it's not art. It's not really culture. Now, I don't want to say conservatives are incapable of making culture, but they do tend to have the worst cultural taste and aesthetic taste. There's a reason why people have always complained about how conservatives have terrible aesthetics, like even in their campaigns, or political groups just have like, it's like embarrassing level of aesthetic sense. Like the Tea Party, everyone used to make fun of like the Tea Party's aesthetics, and there's a reason why. It's like American conservatives at least really do have trash taste, and it's like you're not going to expect these people to really come up with like the great art of today. But even if they did, I don't think, like, even if they were capable of that, it would be deplatformed. It would not have the type of platform of what is liberal culture today. It would not be on the major platforms. It would not be on Netflix. You wouldn't have a major movie. A Hollywood studio would not greenlight, a movie that is explicitly right wing. in a way, even though there will be TV shows and movies that like, have like surprisingly right-wing themes in them, they're not necessarily intended as these propaganda efforts. And that's one thing is like when conservatives try to create culture, it just becomes like really like lower quality propaganda compared to the left. I mean, Daily Wire is trying to make all these movies and stuff, and it's just like they're making like knockoff like Lifetime TV show like specials. Like they did one about like a school shooting, I think, and they're planning to do a lot more with like Gina Carano and others, and you're just like, come on, like, and this is like not going to reach a larger audience. So maybe another reason why people want these cultural things is they believe that the real way to reach the masses is through culture, and that is true. If there was like a big movie that came out and then it had like a very right-wing theme, and people are like, "Oh, I'm really inspired by this," and like, "Oh, did you know that the intended purpose of this movie was to get you to believe this?" And you're like, "Oh, well, maybe I am more inclined to believe that." I understand that, but the things that are made within the conservative culture are just stay within the conservative culture. Like they're not reaching the mainstream. Like Daily Wire's movies are not going to change the minds of the masses. It's just going to be enjoyed by Daily Wire readers who are already have these positions. It's just reaffirming their stances. And that is like, and people have always made this point. It's like, well, we need to interact with the culture because that's where we can change people's minds. And that is true, but like you can't get into people's minds if you're just producing your own your novels and your movies just for yourselves. Now there is like a benefit to that. I mean, people want to enjoy, if they're like big fictional readers or whatever, they want to enjoy, fiction or music that, reaffirms their values. Like, I understand that, but it's not like you're circumventing the libtard control and then you're reaching the masses through like your poorly produced Daily Wire movie or this novel that just came out. And even a lot of the distant right, like I'm not knocking novels, people who are writing novels, because that is like enjoyed by the wider subculture of the dissident right, and people really do enjoy that stuff. And I'm not going to knock your work if you have this creative outlet and you want to do it. But I think people need to realize that that's not actually, that's not reaching the masses. And so that point that like we need to create culture in order to reach people, it's really just creating and reaffirming your own subculture. And that's what the people are interacting with. And it's not necessarily like some normie picks up your novel and then like their whole life has changed. Now there are some right-wing cultural outlets that exist right now, but people aren't going to really enjoy them. Like I've tried to get people to, enjoy metal. I mean, metal is like mostly apolitical, and most of the bands, like there's no political themes. I mean, it's mostly about fantasy or horror or other topics that have nothing to do with politics. But I mean, even in that self, that's somewhat reactionary to not talk about everyday life and not talk about social and political issues. In some ways, that's like a rejection of what they want you to talk about in the mainstream. But most people don't even want to listen to metal, and even the very metal that has like the most right-wing themes, like black metal, the average American conservative is not going to like black metal, no matter how much I try to get people highly cultured and highly respected. I just don't think it's going to happen. Even my own audience betrayed me. Like last week when I talked about black metal for 10 minutes, I noticed that there was a notable decline in the live viewership. There's like 50 people logged off. I was like, wow, okay, they did not want to be highly cultured. But even so, that I'm like, I understand that like this is not going to be the culture that people are going to rely on. And there's like other things, like I mean, like particularly with like music, you do have neo folk, and of course with like if you want to go back in the past, there's tons of great literature and tons of other great artwork and stuff that is done by people who would now be considered right wing. But like I said, that's like not what the average American conservative, when they talk about this culture, they want something meant for the masses. But there are more mainstream things that I think people should get into or focus on, and that makes them less susceptible to the regime's themes and ideas that they want to get into. Like I know people are going to enjoy rap and are going to like rap, and I'm not going to be like, you shouldn't listen to that or whatever. It's like people are going to listen to whatever music they like. despite my best efforts. But I really do, people do need to acknowledge like the harm that rap has caused in our society. Like anytime you want to complain about Black Lives Matter and like whites being down for Black Lives Matter or like worshiping blacks, or you know, where we're now at this point in society where we have black privilege enshrined and they are truly magic Americans. Rap has got us to that point. It's like whites listening to that and beginning to adopt black culture and black mannerisms and you know, see the world through their eyes. You know, that does make them more inclined to support BLM, even though I know there's a lot of conservatives and stuff who like rap. But it's ultimately like the regime's favorite music is rap because it's diverse. It's not white people music, and it can never be like, no one's ever going to say it's like white people music. White people are going to enjoy it, and there's of course going to be white rappers, but it's always going to be seen as like an exclusively black form of music, and it's just whites imitating it. And that's how it's always going to be seen like. And even like the rappers people like it, they're like, oh, they have some things. He said like this pro-God song, and then like you have to look at his behavior, and it's like, I don't think this guy is who you want to make as a hero, like somebody like Kanye West. It's like, I find him interesting, funny as a meme, but it's also like his music's like incredibly basic. And I remember, you know, when he first got big in 2018, and like conservatives like, finally conservative artist, and then he had like a big single out that was like incredibly vulgar song about sex. It was like his single out, and I was like imagining all these like 60-year-old conservatives like, oh, I want to listen to Kanye, and they're like listening to it, it's like, oh my lord. And it's like that's like a much of his work. And like, I'm not saying like you shouldn't listen to Kanye or whatever, but I mean, like the point of the matter is, if you want to impact culture, you should at least surround yourself with culture that you know doesn't push society in a negative direction. And I think there's like mainstream music, like I think just like more people like listening to country or just like classic rock and stuff, it's like that is much better than listening to rap. I'm not saying like people are gonna listen to rap whatever, but I do think like people need to acknowledge like the harmful effect it's had on our society, and it's making even like white kids like become wiggers, like in a way it's even much more widespread than even when I was a kid. When I was a kid, like wiggers were like a joke. Like Malibu's Most Wanted was a comedy for a reason. Like most Zoomers probably have no idea what Malibu's Most Wanted was. It was a comedy where this guy who's like raised by a wealthy family, he's like a wigger, and like the whole movie is about like how he's not. How he's a complete opposite of a gangbanger, and like that's like the laugh of it. It's like that, like the whole like culture, like we knew that wiggers were around, but people like all hated them. And now it's like imitating those culture and mannerisms are now much more prevalent among Zoomers. Like there's this recent video that caused a lot of debate about the Zoomer who is trying to guess the age of a woman, and he's using slang I have no earthly idea. He's like, oh, bustin', shee, and he's like, hit a quick spin. You know, he's like just imitating mannerisms and language that are definitely not white. And people are like, I'm talking to, like, do you guys actually talk like this? They're like, yeah, actually a lot of Zoomers do talk like this, and this is like normal behavior, and it is like a complete shift. From even when I was a kid, and now I feel like old. It's like old millennial hours, like watching that video. But I mean, it does like that. Those guys are not going to be people who are going to like understand that like he's a part of a people, and that there's like a consciousness that comes with being a white American. Like that guy is not going to see that at all. Like that guy is like, he imitates black culture, and he himself wants to imitate their behavior and mannerisms and their speak, and that's no bueno. That's no bueno at all. Now there's other things that make that video funny that there's some admirable traits in that video. Like it is like a funny video, but at the end of the day, you don't want like the young generation to be like that young gentleman who's talking about bussin'. You want them to resemble how their grandparents were, and that's not a person who's going to uphold that type of cultural tradition. And you have to see rap's effect in making that possible. So yeah, I think I know people, as I keep repeating, so I'm not going to bear repeating. It's like, yeah, people are going to listen to rap, but you need to push people in the right direction of enjoying cultural norms that are less harmful. So going along with his enjoyment of rap, I really want to emphasize this point that a main reason you don't see conservative culture is that conservatives themselves are fine with the liberal cultural forms that and media that they enjoy. I mean, they still listen to rap, they still watch, and even these conservative commentators, they love these prestige shows that have all libtard themes and are designed to please libtards. Conservative commentators love it just as much as the next one. They all still watch the NFL, even though it's, turned itself into a Black Lives Matter propaganda vehicle. They'll even watch the NBA, which is like even worse. So you see this, that the conservatives don't actually demand a different culture, and they don't seek different culture that upholds their values and is, not harmful to, or is not trying to brainwash their kids into hating themselves for being white. They can't even do that basic assessment or basic stand. And that is why one of the reasons that, the whole culture, it reflects left liberalism. So it's both a nature of power, the artists and the entertainers and the leagues and the studios, they all want to appease power, which is entirely in the hands of the left liberals. And at the same time, on the lower end, conservatives don't actually demand for culture to reflect their own values. Like, they don't protest movies anymore that, that violate their values and their sensibilities. They don't even demand movies and music anymore that are like that. They enjoy all these movies and music that are very libtarded. And so there's no demand there, and there's no reason for these studios to we want to appease people in power, but we also see that those conservatives that we're, showing as the villains in our TV shows, and we're shooting and maiming and doing all these terrible things in our TV shows, they're still watching it and slopping it all up. So why do we have to even bother appeasing them? They're going to watch anyway. And so a real way that you can, show your effect on the culture is by stopping your continued consumption of these products, of these sports leagues, of these TV shows that are hostile towards your beliefs. Turn it off. That's the easiest way to make an effect. And there are plenty of cultural things that you can enjoy. I'm not talking about completely isolating yourself, but you have to make choices about what you watch and what you support. And I think the number one target to circle this all the way around to what the original topic is to go after the NFL. If you hurt the NFL where it hurts, or I'm saying that repeatedly, but if you hurt the NFL and they see a marked drop in attendance, marked drop in tickets and merchandise sales, and the ratings even go further, that will change their behavior. That will make them more likely to try to appease that audience that they alienated. And if you continue to support it and you use cope reasons to say it is I need my entertainment, or, my whole family are Lions fans, or whatever, as the reasons are stupid, turn it off. Make a stand. Make a difference. And that's how you can make a difference, is by no longer watching the NFL. And if you want to watch a sport, there are plenty of other options for you to watch. But you really need to cut out the NFL and cut out the NBA. And if you were watching MLS at any point, I wonder how you ever got to listening to Highly Respected, but maybe there are some MLS fans out there. So that's the thing. It's conservatives actually need to exert themselves when it comes to these cultural formats and demand culture that reflects their, I don't want to necessarily say their taste, because they do, as I said, they do typically have terrible taste, but reflect their values and their worldview. And that starts by, changing your habits to supporting culture that actually supports your worldview and values, or doesn't at least violate them or attack or is hostile to them. So that's the general point I want to make about culture. I think in that discussion between Fantano and Rubin, both sides are wrong. There's been conservatives always saying conservatism is the new punk rock, or conservatism is the new counterculture. In some ways, yeah, because the mainstream culture is entirely lib, but at the same time, you're not actually producing any culture. You're producing Tom McDonald, which that's its own thing. So that's the point I want to make. I think you're still going to see culture playing to the biases of left liberalism because they're the ones in power, and conservatives don't exert themselves to demand actual culture that is going to appeal to a wide audience and is actually going to reflect conservative values. Now on to our cognitive elite questions. And we've got a cultural question today, but as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack at HighlyRespectedSubstack.com. And you can also get the opportunity to listen to our bonus IQ supplements every week if you sign up at HighlyRespected.substack.com. This one comes from Reagan. He asked, and that's really his name. I'm not making it up. This is not Ronald Reagan. That's his first name. He asked me, Scott, what are your favorite fiction that you like to read besides Lord of the Rings? He took away Lord of the Rings because I believe I talked about liking Lord of the Rings in past podcasts. And this is going to be really basic, at least for a right-winger, of what I like to read for fiction. I don't actually read fiction that much. I pretty much only read nonfiction. I will read maybe one fictional work a year. And even the stuff I do read, it's like the great classics is like the Homeric epics or, Paradise Lost or something like that. I mean, the Homeric epics are my favorite work of literature. So it's like not necessarily it's stuff like that, even though that might count as poetry, and not necessarily what people think about fiction. They do think of the mindset of Lord of the Rings. It's like something like a novel. That's what they're thinking of. But I do have very basic takes. I like H.P. Lovecraft. As a high schooler, I was really into Louis Ferdinand Céline. Journey to the End of the Night was my favorite novel. I'd have to read it again. I'd probably find it too negative and cynical and nihilistic today, but I really enjoyed that in high school. I liked Bret Easton Ellis. I liked American Psycho. I didn't like Less Than Zero. I liked some of Dostoevsky. I recently read Brothers Karamazov. I thought it was pretty good. I had parts, one thing I found annoying is maybe as I get older, and maybe it may have been the translation, is that it's like a long monologue from a character that's like several pages, and they're like, oh, this guy's still talking, and it's like his own mental illness is speaking. One work that I really enjoyed, that I surprisingly enjoyed, was War and Peace by Tolstoy. I just read the whole thing, and it was actually a very good narrative. It felt like, you're reading an opera, and the way it's structured and shaped. So I really enjoyed it. Interesting characters, and it's just a great storyline to follow along. And yes, it's several hundred pages, but it's worth it. I actually recommend War and Peace. What else is in there for the list? I guess that some people were wanting the trashier stuff that I read, but it's even if I haven't read too much horror and fantasy in a long time. I mean, I liked Dracula as a kid, and this is very generic basic stuff. I like Frankenstein. I even read the Game of Thrones books, Song of Ice and Fire. I actually enjoyed those. Those are I think that for trash literature, just an easy read. I found those very enjoyable. George R.R. Martin. It's I've just came off a discussion of avoiding libtard and stuff, but it's not like that. Even though Martin himself is a huge lib, the works themselves aren't that bad, and the books are much better than the show. Even though I enjoyed the show, or at least its early seasons, there's just a lot of good fiction out there. But it's if I'm generally going to read something, it's going to be the classics. I've been meaning to read Moby Dick. I haven't gotten around to it. I've been meaning to read Dune, and I have not gotten around to it. I think I've owned a copy of Dune for 8 years, and I have just not gotten around to it. Because I mostly just focus on nonfiction. I pretty much only read nonfiction. But there's a lot of good stuff out there. Most of it was stuff I read as a kid, or a teenager. So it was H.P. Lovecraft, Dracula, of course Tolkien, and I read George R.R. Martin when early 2010. So I was no longer a teenager then, unfortunately. But I'm going to try to get more into fiction over time. I mean, it is, you want to have some difference with what you're reading. If it's all nonfiction, you kind of do enjoy a good fictional work. that comes in. One of the more recent things, I think I read this, a year or so ago, was The Warwolf, which is a famous German nationalist novel. It's set in the 30 Years' War, and it's about this community of villagers who band together to stop the marauding bands that are like plaguing villagers and peasants throughout the countryside. And during 30 Years' War, Germany, about a third of Germany had died during the war. So it was very devastating for ordinary peasants and villagers. And it's a pretty good novel. It's very violent. It's surprisingly very violent for the age it was written in the early 1900s. Yeah, it's pretty good, and it's also got some cool right-wing themes in it. So that's like one work I enjoyed. So I just need to get more into reading fiction so I can have a better answer next time rather than just being very basic. So I'm trying to, and that's by Herman Luns, L-O-N-S, who wrote it, and I actually recommend reading that. So that's like me trying to suggest something that's not so basic. Like, I think pretty much everyone's heard of War and Peace. Most people have read Dostoevsky. Most people read H.P. Lovecraft. If you haven't read H.P. Lovecraft, highly recommend reading H.P. Lovecraft. Most people read Dracula and Frankenstein. And most people have probably read American Psycho too. That's even probably the most basic thing. And I really enjoyed that when I read that in high school. That says something about me. So this is like kind of the basic stuff, but I want to suggest something that's not so basic, that's probably not been on many recommendation reading lists. So, I'll probably end it there because unfortunately don't have the greatest answer in the world for that because I don't read much fiction, but I do need to read more of it, take a break from all the nonfiction that I'm giving you guys and reading and reporting on for the IQ supplements. So that's it for today. Make sure you sign up for those IQ supplements at highlyrespected.substack.com. We'll be back next Monday, and we'll, of course, have an IQ supplement for you guys later this week. So until next time, stay respected.